Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Go back. Okay. So welcome everyone to Diggin In. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of this speaker series. Diggin In is a series of live presentations with archaeologists from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. Join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time through November for our presentations. For a schedule of dates and presenters, please visit us at peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. Viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the chat function on the side of your Zoom screen. And at the conclusion of the presentation, we will give our speaker time to answer as many as they can, with the understanding that we might not get to all of them. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Suanna Crowley with us. Dr. Crowley is a scientist, fundraiser, and public relations leader working at the intersection of the humanities and the sciences. As the founder of Headfort Consulting, LLC, Dr. Crowley has been a key contributor to global science events, including the Event Horizon Telescope and the 2019 global announcement for the first ever black hole image that reached 4.5 billion people. However, she does have a doctoral degree from the New York University, and her early career was focused on anthropological, archaeological, and geoscientific research in the US, the Middle East, South Asia, and Europe, and where she worked in applied setting as a researcher, instructor, and public outreach practitioner. And so Dr. Crowley is also the current president of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, although sadly her term does end this November. But welcome, Dr. Crowley. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you so much for having me. I have to send out a huge round of thanks and gratitude to you personally for shepherding, digging in, creating it, shepherding it, making it go, and getting the RS Peabody Institute of Archaeology to also be a leader in putting this together and making this happen and bringing the MAS in on this project, which has been, I think, very successful and very fulfilling. Certainly, we know we've encountered dozens of people that we haven't before, and we're very excited to have them kind of in the fold of archaeology, learning on these Wednesday afternoons. So huge thanks to you, Lindsay.
Well, thank you.
Also want to say a big thank you to Ryan Wheeler. He may be on the call. I know he's been attending as the executive director of the Institute, and want to say thanks to him for his partnership, and also acknowledge Vic Mastone, who is our candidate for the upcoming president of the MAS, and I think he will slide successfully into that spot. So we're looking forward to him taking the reins going forward. But today we are here to talk a little bit of snack-sized excitement about archaeology, and in particular, the field that I study, which is called geoarchaeology. So we're going to talk about what is geoarchaeology and how the geosciences influence research in archaeology. And we're going to use the case study of a site called Seneca Village. So let me get started with sharing the screen, and we will dive in. Just a moment, pausing for technology here. There we go. Can everybody see? Looks like we've got a shared screen active. So we're going to talk a little bit about the early New York City landscape, and in particular a settlement called Seneca Village, which was an African-American enclave from about 1825 to 1857, so prior to the Civil War, a 19th century enclave in the central part of New York, in a part of New York that was largely unoccupied, largely undeveloped as compared to the downtown of New York. So let's get started with a little bit of an iconic view of Central Park. For anyone out there who is pining for travel and for the opportunity to make it to some place as exciting as New York City, I offer you this soothing image of a fall landscape from the one of the iconic walkways in Central Park. This is really a discussion partly about urban archaeology, how you do archaeology in the middle of a big city, partly about the history of a very special population. The African American population freed slaves, as I said, right before the Civil War during the early abolitionist movement. And also about the sciences of around geoarchaeology, which adds just a little bit of extra information to the discussion and the understanding of the human imprint on the landscape. So the story of the Seneca Village site, this is just a Google map giving you a little bit of a physical orientation to the location we're going to talk about. Central Park, of course, iconic. Designed and constructed by Frederick Law Olmsted in the late 1850s into the 1860s. But you have to think of Central Park as a manufactured landscape. You have to think of it as a built environment, every bit as built as the large skyscrapers that surround it. Before Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux designed and executed their plan inside of this region, central part of Manhattan Island, it was largely unoccupied. Farmland, some scrubby bush areas, some people were squatters, there were small shanty sort of environments, settlements, not something that is the landscape that you think of today. As a matter of fact, when we began the project back in 2004, fall 2004, the Central Park Conservancy had an arborist who was with us during part of the project and noted to me that there were only 3 trees that predated the landscaping effort that took place to create the environment of Central Park, what we all think of as this pastoral oasis in the middle of Manhattan. So again, a very built environment. And as a matter of fact, you can see here, we're talking about the west side of the park. We're looking at an area close to the American Museum of Natural History, Central Park West, roughly 81st, 82nd, all the way up to 89th Streets, if you're familiar with that part of town. And so a region beginning in 1825, where a freed African slave named Andrew Williams, first bought a plot of land along with the AME Zion Church, which had established in southern Manhattan. 2 other individual African-American men, all 3 went in on the purchase on a single day in 1825 from a farmer who was selling plots of land, this sort of scrubby bushland in the central part of New York. There was a reservoir there early on, so there had been some landscaping and some development, but largely unoccupied. And we'll actually have a couple of historic images to check out in another couple of minutes. So here we are on the west side, of course, some of the most expensive real estate now, even in the pandemic. So a very desirable, certainly in this moment, very desirable neighborhood to be in. Now, I tell the story of the geoarchaeology. I tell the story of the dirt. My nickname is Dr. Dirt. Some of you know that. Some of you call me that regularly, and I enjoy it greatly as a nickname. But really the story of Seneca Village and this particular settlement is this unique story of freed African slaves who moved into this region of Manhattan, which was farther from some of the racist and discriminatory practices and environments and attitudes of downtown Manhattan in the early 19th century. And this group of individuals became property owners at a very unique point in time. They became property owners and established a community at its high point, really around 300 individuals living in the Seneca Village community. There were churches, there was a school, there were 2 cemeteries. This over time, over a short period of time, starting 1825 again, became an enclave and a well-established enclave at that. Community members had set up small shops, were certainly traveling into other parts of Manhattan for work, but had really created their own more protected, more isolated settlement. Beginning in the 1840s, a wave of new migrants came into Seneca Village, and this included Irish and German immigrants, some of them indentured servants, who also moved into this enclave and became property owners. We think in maybe one or more cases, intermarrying with the families of the freed African slaves. And we do have census records seen here, 1855, where named members of the families, and later census records would show that daughters of the families also became property owners. So this very distinct, very unique social enclave, property owners inside of Manhattan. Now, I mentioned that the project began about 2004, 2005. Some of you will remember 2004, the fall of 2004, as being the run for the World Series by the Red Sox. I have to tell you that I took a lot of heat wearing a Red Sox hat in the middle of Central Park during the whole run for the World Series, but I managed to do it. I wore the colors for Boston, and I represented right there in the middle of Central Park. But it was a very unique moment to be doing this very first time archaeology in the park. Since that time, the researchers who have been involved have extended well beyond the archaeology and have done a lot of genealogical work, have done a lot of the work looking at the named census records, looking back at the maps, and finding the descendants of the families who lived here, which has been a remarkable addition to the story of Seneca Village. And in this case, we're looking at the census records listing the Wilson and the Benson families, and two photographic portraits that we have of Lyons family members, the husband and wife on the right and the daughters on the left. So as I said, a very unique middle class kind of settlement for freed slaves, and again, later on, Irish and German immigrants. So let's move ahead to just a quick view. This is a lithograph from 1854, so right before the moment when Seneca Village was actually closed. It was shut down by eminent domain. I mentioned Frederick Law Olmsted being the designer with Calvert Bow of Central Park. Interestingly enough, Olmsted was a noted abolitionist, but this movement toward creating a pastoral landscape for communities that were trapped in cities, finding this, lovely sort of English countryside landscape, recreating that for urban communities, was deemed a priority. And in fact, they moved out the settlers of Seneca Village by eminent domain in 1857. So this marvelous enclave had a very short lifespan in the center of Manhattan. The families were dispersed. They were given funds paid for their property at a much lower rate, of course, than you would have expected for the time and the location. But they were dispersed across Manhattan and into the Bronx and the Queens and elsewhere, making it difficult for some of that early work on genealogy and the legacies of those families to be conducted. So it's just been the last 5 or 6 years where some of that genealogical work has been done, and great-great-great-granddaughters of some of the first settlers have been identified. So here we see, this is called the Eggbert Ville map of Seneca Village, just at the moment when the village was being closed down by eminent domain. The north is to your right on the screen, and you can see that this was a remarkable little assortment of buildings, some of them 1 and 2 stories. There were outbuildings associated with these residences, sort of shop environments, and quite an elaborate settlement of what were referred to as shanties, but it was apparently by all measures a warm and welcoming settlement and environment. As I said, schools, churches, cemeteries, a fully functioning independent settlement in the middle of Manhattan. We'll come back to this map in just a minute. Here you see again, sort of right at that moment, 1856, 1857, a historic photograph. And if you can see my cursor, you're going to notice this is an image of what is believed to be either the kind of a structure or house that belonged to one of the Seneca families, or something that was quite similar from another resident elsewhere in the park. So simple structures, simple domestic households with lots of course, archaeology, lots of artifacts, hopefully to look for. Now, here's the thing. Let's move on to our next. We're going to talk a little bit about geoarchaeology, but I'm going to put something out there for you to think about as we go forward. The prospect of building something as large, re-landscaping something as large as Central Park was a tremendous effort, and hundreds of individuals, laborers were involved. Olmsted, this was very much a gem for him, and Calvert Vaux. I spent a great deal of time not necessarily researching the design, but researching what went into the re-landscaping effort, what went into the actual labor. And I discovered something on the order of 5 million cubic feet of fill and soil imported from New Jersey and Long Island, brought in, and with massive effort in regrading and reshaping the natural landscape, what was there at the time. So the prospect of trying to find something like Seneca Village, the footprint of those houses, was daunting. Researchers from City University of New York and Columbia and the New York Historical Society, as well as others before them, had done a great deal of documentary research on Seneca, but it wasn't a certainty that anything of the footprint, any of the archaeology was left after something as massive a scale as the re-landscaping project that built Central Park. So this is where they brought me in and brought in the perspective of geoarchaeology. So geoarchaeology, simply, it's the application of earth science approaches to archaeological problems. Archaeology is great for borrowing liberally from other sciences, you all know that, and this is no exception. As a geoarchaeologist, I was trained in soils, sedimentology, geomorphology, and a host of other kinds of subfields where the techniques were quite useful in looking at that interaction between humans and landscape. Many of you may be more familiar with some of the subfields like micromorphology, some aspects of remote sensing. Those also can sometimes be categorized as geoarchaeology, but the approach that I take is really a landscape approach. It's looking from those very minute details of the soils and settlements all the way up to the progression and dynamics of landscape, and of course the humans that live on those landscapes. So a couple of sticky ideas just to give you the introduction. I know that some of you out there know dirt, but we're just going to talk very generally about the usefulness of soils and settlements and the perspective. One of the great ideas behind geoarchaeology is that dirt tells time. Soils and sediments help tell you the time. And this is a soil profile. Many archaeologists in the field know it well. The ABC layer cake. When you start to look at the complexity of landscapes, you start to see those layer cakes repeat themselves, and you start to understand those packages of soils and sediments as moving you back through time and giving you a sense of relative progression. When you're lucky enough, of course, absolute dates as well with radiocarbon and other means. Dirt also tells you something about past landscapes. So not only are we getting a sense of our time depth, but we're also looking at the dynamics of whether, let's say, islands in the center of a river were suddenly welded into that side landscape that became the floodplain. And how do the dynamics of humans interacting on an island in the middle of the stream and all the resources there, how does that change over time as that island gradually becomes a floodplain, gradually becomes an elevated terrace, et cetera, et cetera. So we look at the details of the soils and the settlements to help us figure out our past landscapes. And lastly, most importantly for Seneca, it helps to define site potential. In this case, we didn't know if anything was left of the original footprint of Seneca, and we needed a low-key, low-tech technique, something that was not going to violate OSHA rules, very small holes, very quick tests, something that was going to give us a lot of information in a very short period of time. So I was brought in to examine this map and try to figure out what was left on the modern landscape of Central Park, and to be able to start to develop a testing procedure, a novel testing procedure for Central Park. Before this, there had been agricultural scientists, soil scientists who had done soil maps of the park, particularly of those fill episodes that Olmsted had brought in, but otherwise they had not done a great deal of archaeology, particularly for this historic period. So we overlaid the map onto a region that was sort of that modern map of the topography and the historic map of the house arrangements, and we developed a transect testing system. So what did we do? If you are very familiar with some of the typical testing techniques like 1-by-1 units or larger test pit units, we didn't do any of that. We didn't have permission from Central Park or the City of New York to actually open large test areas. We examined the subsoil using quick and easy handheld tools like this auger testing stick. And this is a close-up of an auger bucket, which basically uses people power, upper body strength, to dig a little hole and to extract in sequence the soils that we need to look at and ask questions about. So replicating the areas around where we knew the historic homes were from the GIS work that City University and Columbia had done, we created a series of tested transects where we were able to extract very interesting looking soils. You can see here, we were able to crisscross the landscape of the western part of the park and look for changes in these soils based on principles of color change and texture change and artifacts, which we were also able to recover, and really start to look at profiles at depth to say, this looks like a fill episode on top of something that might be a buried surface, and then we get a little gap, and maybe there's another buried surface under there of some kind. There's some kind of change happening. When you take all of those and you start to build them out across a landscape and transects, you start to see patterns in the soil. And these patterns start to point you in the direction of maybe something is really still there. The site potential exists. There is something to go on and test and to lobby for. So this particular diagram, we did not have elevation control. We had latitude and longitude control thanks to some early GPS systems. But overall, I was able to demonstrate with this very low tech technique in punching small holes into the surface of Central Park that something might be there, something that contained some historic artifacts, maybe of the right time period, was buried beneath the fill episodes that Olmsted had put in place for the beautification of the overall Central Park. So we were able to really take some of that individual history, look at the places where those individuals had homes on other historic maps, target our testing to those particular areas where we thought, fingers crossed, there might be something there. And then teams over a fall period, over that run for the pennant period in the fall of 2004, teams from City University, Rutgers, NYU, Columbia, went out into the field and learned more than they ever expected to about dirt. But we were able to achieve enough certainty to go back. The project directors were able to go back and actually lobby Central Park Conservancy for access and the ability to really put in larger scale test pits in the footprint of these transects and examine in greater detail. Took about 7 years to get that permission, but they did go back and were able to recover pieces of transfer printed or export porcelain and other objects that were just the right time frame and very likely material culture associated with the named families that they knew of from the historic maps. So, very brief snack-sized introduction to the topic of Seneca Village. And I've replicated here a couple of those very interesting resources that are out there, one from the time right after our first testing, and then some of these more elaborate resources diving into the family histories, extending the archaeology into a more complete picture. I do want to acknowledge, of course, the folks who made this happen, Diana Wall, Nan Rothschild, Cynthia Copeland, and Herbert Signoret, who were all involved in universities in the city and really championed going out there, doing this in 2004, 2005, and then going back in 2011, and then also shepherding through the 2018-2019 period, where even more of those historical and genealogical resources were brought to bear on the story of Seneca Village. So with that, I think maybe, Lindsay, we might have a minute or two for questions.
Yes, we do. So please send your questions in. But since, you know, I'm the host, I'll begin because, again, I love hearing you talk about dirt because I don't ever really know enough about it. It's not something we typically learn in grad school or things like that. So what got you interested in this? I know it's not related to Seneca Village, but like, what got you into learning about dirt?
Learning about it? Well, many of you who've gone through graduate school in archaeology or are thinking about archaeology for further schooling, what you'll learn is that you're asked to pick a time, a place, and a thing, an artifact, or a category, a material culture category. So I started out life thinking I was going to work in the Bronze Age period of the Middle East. And I really could not decide between geology and archaeology. I found myself pulled in both directions between the earth sciences and the social sciences. And by the time I'd really gotten, you know, out of undergraduate and into graduate school, this sort of newish forming field, they had a few practitioners, but it was really starting to take off, this combination, this interdisciplinary field. And I found myself falling in love with dirt, with soils and sediments, as kind of that forgotten artifact. It does retain, if we had more time, we'd talk about the chemical fingerprint of soils. We'd look more at the physical characteristics of the soils and actually how humans change those processes, change those dynamics, and shape the landscape. And you can see them and quantify them through geoarchaeological means. And so it was a combination of kind of that, you know, left out category of material and very few practitioners in the world. So the very first part of my career had great potential for travel and contributing to some really interesting science.
Very cool. So we have another question from Claire. So how is the site marked or acknowledged now in Central Park? Are there interpretive signs or anything of the such that describe the site?
There are, fortunately there are. So if you were to walk into the area around the Spectre Playground, around the 86th Street transverse and 85th Street entrance, you would see signage that is descriptive and really recounts the history of Seneca Village to passersby in Central Park, which does get millions of visitors a year. So there is a good amount of people who stop and interpret. There are a few locations where you can actually see the physical remnants. There's a set of corner stones that were part of one of the churches still visible at the surface of the landscape, and you can see that. The Central Park Conservancy has set up website information, so it's more explorable. So there's this combination of things you can see in the park and the footprint itself, as well as things that you can explore online. And Seneca, interestingly enough, is not the only settlement of this kind. There are a few other places where you see enclaves of freed African slaves establishing themselves, becoming property owners, handing property down over a couple of generations, and really establishing very deeply rooted, economically stable settlements, only to be dispersed or removed forcibly. So there are these wonderful moments in time to really explore a slice of history that I think needs a little bit more spotlight.
Cool. So we have another question from Dan. Has anyone been able to do a georadar survey or other remote sensing techniques on the site?
Absolutely. So they did do some remote sensing in the summer before I came on board. So they wanted to be very thorough in their approach. The project directors wanted to be very thorough in their approach. The requests from Central Park and from the city of New York were that no large holes could be opened up in the middle of this very well-traversed area of the park. They didn't want any liability claims coming back to haunt them because somebody had fallen in to an archaeological site that wasn't secured or could be easily manipulated, like boards on a test unit. So they did not initially agree, is my understanding from the project directors. They didn't agree to that. So we were left with the remote sensing option, which was resistivity testing, and then this very quick, low-tech, punch a hole with an auger, fill it right back in process that I developed as a novel approach in really testing the subsurface. So it was a good combination in that early phase of examination.
Oh, cool. So our last question for you today is from Caroline. What do you think soil sediments are such an important category of research for archaeology? And do you think they are often overlooked?
They are overlooked. If I could have a soapbox in front of any graduate school that would let me in to just spend that hour with students who are really thinking about archaeology as a career, there is a lot of detail that goes into understanding these soils and sediments. There's a great many ways that it is incorrectly recorded in archaeological field notes. Because there isn't the just little bit of training that it takes to tell the difference between very fine sand and a very coarse silt. And there are differences that you can tell, and they're important when you go back to interpret environments. I think it's overlooked because we're asked to specialize in a lot, take on a lot as graduate students and practitioners in academic and CRM archaeology. And so it tends to be a category that's soils and sediments, geoarchaeology in general. Having worked all over the world, I don't see it happening as much in New England as I do in other places. So I like to hop on that soapbox and advocate for that little bit of education, that approach that makes your life easier when you're out in the field in terms of recording, and then that helpfulness and interpretive approach that goes into some of academic and CRM work. One of the best uses for geoarchaeology is the site potential factor. And this is something that you can bring a geoarchaeologist like myself in to examine a landscape or an area where a site is thought to be. And really that person, that scientist, can construct an efficient approach to understanding, to excavating quickly and more efficiently those kinds of sites and getting the most information out of them. Secret success for geoarchaeologists, we don't even always need the site to be on. We can dig off-site and really look at the dynamics of landscape and human interaction without disturbing some of those very important and ultimately non-renewable archaeological sites. So good question, thank you.
So very cool, and she does own her own company, so she is for hire for any professional archaeologists out there. And we just got a message from one of our listeners, Jessica, just wanting to let us know that the Central Park signage for Seneca Village, you can find it online. And the collection can actually be viewed online too at the New York City Archaeological Repository. So
they've done a wonderful job making this available, approachable, accessible, and very detailed. So it's worth your time if you get a few minutes to explore Seneca Village on your own.
Well, thank you, Dr. Crowley, for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. For all of our listeners and viewers, please join us in 2 weeks. We will be joined by Grace Bello, who will be talking about the use of XRF in archaeology, focusing on the study and analysis of glass. So hope to see you in 2 weeks, everyone. We will let you go now. Thank you. Bye.